Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of COWTOWN Movie Classics, and welcome to this very special 95th anniversary presentation of Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughs from 1928. It's actually a real pleasure to be sitting here with film historian and film preservationist Mr. Jack Theakston. How's it going today, Jack?
Thank you for having me, Ryan. I really appreciate being here, and this is one of my favorites. So it'll be a real pleasure to talk about this film.
Of course, and this is a wonderful movie, as our audience will see. I feel like it's a great film in its own right. It's incredibly atmospheric with very moody photography from the director Paul Leni, incredible makeup by Jack Pierce, who of course would go on to create the great Universal monsters. But it's a film that I feel like doesn't get enough credit in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a strange film to hem into any one category. A lot of people consider it a historical drama. Some people consider it a straight up horror film. I feel like it somewhere falls in between. It's sort of the same historical melodrama that The Hunchback of Notre Dame for Universal Pictures was in 1923. And of course, this is sort of a follow up to that. It's a great epic scale picture based on a Victor Hugo novel, and with a deformed protagonist in the main role.
I always kind of saw it as the third part of a trilogy, starting with Hunchback of Notre Dame and, of course, Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. So when it was released in 1928, it's an interesting era because they're coming in from the transition of the silent films to sound. And of course, Universal, they hadn't quite reached their their franchise of the classic monsters as they would in the 1930s. So where was Universal Pictures at that time in 1928?
Well, Universal Pictures was essentially a mom and pop major studio. It was run by Carl Laemmle, who was a German immigrant who got into early film Nickelodeon theaters and distribution. And he set this sort of utopia up out in the Los Angeles area in the early 1910s. And most of their bread and butter were short comedies, short melodramas, that sort of thing. And as the company grew, so did the pictures. And by the early 20s, they were producing largely westerns, urban comedies, and romance pictures, things like that, simple mid-tier budget films. And every once in a while or every year, they'd have one or two big pictures that would be released at the start of the season in September and October, and they were called super jewels. They would throw everything budget-wise at the films, and they made huge epic pictures a couple times a year for the audiences, and this happens to be one of those.
His earlier films featured Lon Chaney in two of his most iconic performances. Of course, Lon Chaney, the Man of a Thousand Faces. Why was he not involved with The Man Who Laughs?
Well, even when they made the Phantom of the Opera, he had left MGM as basically a one picture free contract for Universal because he had scored great success and acclaim in Hunchback of Notre Dame. And right after he made that film, he went to Metro Goldwyn Mayer and had a major contract with them. But he did sort of Phantom of the Opera as a passion project for himself. It was his idea to do the film. He wanted to create yet again another great creation with his makeup, and Universal said, "We'll do it." So they went ahead and made that. Now, after that, the production on the Phantom was very troubled. He and the director Rupert Julian really hated each other. Julian really alienated himself from the cast and crew, and Chaney had a very negative experience on the picture. They had to do all these reshoots, and they previewed the film again and again, and it wasn't working. And they finally nailed it, and just in time for the opening of the 1925 movie season, and it scored really well at the box office, made a ton of money. It was considered, again, another great cash in with Hunchback of Notre Dame, which made the studio oodles of money. So they thought they'd hit lightning in the bottle a third time, and by that point, Chaney was not interested in coming back to Universal. So they brought in Conrad Veidt, who had just come to the United States from Germany. And of course, he's terrific in the film, and he's always terrific. I mean, Conrad Veidt is a scorer no matter what you put him in.
Yeah.
And not long after movies went to sound, which would be around the time that this film was released. Veidt then moved back to Europe. He initially moved to England, and then again re-immigrated to this country in the mid-30s.
Yeah. Well, of course, Veidt is an incredible performer. At this point in his career, probably his most famous movie to today's audiences was The Captain of Dr. Caligari in 1921. Was that film a big success in the United States? Was he well known in America at that time?
He was more well known for other German imported films that were made in the mid 20s. Caligari was not particularly a successful film in this country. It fell under a number of protests of anti German sentiment that were going on around 1920, 1921 post war. And it was just too artsy for most people. So it was released by Goldwyn in these states, but it wasn't until in the late 20s that the Museum of Modern Art sort of revived it, that it became considered an art film classic. He was relatively a newcomer in the US when he made this film.
Yeah, well, it's an incredible performance. He's amazing. The film team's vied up with the top billed Mary Philbin, who, of course, was Christine Daae in Phantom of the Opera. She's
Right.
amazing. What does our audience have to look forward to in the next hour and a half or so?
I would say just let your inhibitions go with this film. It's a wild, epic film of an epic scale. It's very much in the style of Paul Leni's other films, where it's a very artistic film. It is the height of the silent filmmaking art form as it was in the late 20s. It actually, in many ways, I think, is a great co-piece in comparison with Murnau's Sunrise, because it's equally as artistic in its execution, but it's also a really great example of Universal Pictures being that well-oiled filmmaking machine.
All right, well, Jack, thank you so much. For you guys in the audience, please stick around after the film so you guys can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from 1928, directed by Paul Leni, The Man Who Laughs. To me, that's still a very entertaining, powerful film.
I think it's a terrific triumph of movie artwork. I mean, it really is an artistic film, first and foremost. And the German influence that Leni brought to it, can't be denied. The sets, the costumes, the photography, it's really high class.
And that's what's funny. It's funny you mentioned that because this is one of those films where obviously it was a Hollywood production, it was shot in the United States, but it often does get mistakenly lumped in with people think, oh, it's a German movie, as Conrad Veidt, it's like Nosferatu or Captain Dr. Caligari, but this was a Hollywood made film. And of course, Universal, a lot of those early studios were famous for importing the best European talent to come over here and direct their films.
Yes, Carl Laemmle was great at scouting talent in Europe. He was a European himself. Of course, a lot of the times there was a little nepotism involved there too.
Yeah.
The Laemmle family obviously had bread on their tables, but he knew good talent when he saw it. And Leni was a good import. And even at that point, we're still in the silent era here. So we're talking about strictly visuals. There's no dialogue really necessary. In the silent days, they just insert title cards that had the language that you spoke. So it was truly a universal, forgive the pun, a universal art form.
You look at The Man Who Laughs, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, on a technical level, this is a much better made movie. It's a much more visually interesting movie than a lot of those earlier Universal Lon Chaney collaborations. And
Yeah, this has a
yeah,
strong director to it, and not anything against Wallace Worsley, who did The Hunchback of Notre Dame,
yeah,
or Rupert Julian, who did Phantom of the Opera. But Leni had kind of formed his own style, and it was very fluid and dynamic. Whereas Worsley and the Phantom director had kind of a more by the books approach.
yeah. But those are still wonderful movies. I don't want to take anything away from that. But so Paul Leni? It's kind of unfortunate because you look at The Cat and the Canary, again, another very engaging, entertaining film, The Man Who Laughs. What happened to him after this film?
Well, he made one more film, Last Performance,
Mhm.
and that was released in 29. And he ended up having an early death that year from a tooth infection that got too bad and ended up killing him. Kind of a strange way to go, but his career basically got killed just as the silent films got killed too.
Which is very unfortunate because it makes you wonder what he could have done on a completely talking sound production.
Yeah, absolutely. He brings to mind other directors from that period, like to a certain degree, obviously Eric von Stroheim, who also did big epic scale films, usually running way more over budget though than Lenny did. Von Sternberg, of course. There are a slew of these great, and Murnau, of course. Friedrich Murnau would be in the same category as Paul Leni, as these hyper visual directors. So it would have been interesting to see what they did in the sound era when everything technically kind of got pulled back a bit because you couldn't do the same sort of fluid camera work for a while that you could in the silent era.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that because actually last week we shot the 1920 version of The Mark of Zorro. Incredibly entertaining film. I'm a big fan of it. But you just look at a technical level, you look at the direction, the way the camera is set up, it's all very straightforward there. And here we are 8 years later, the camera is moving, there's all these intricate dissolves and editing techniques, and it just seems like the filmmaking process had gone a long way from the beginning of the 1920s to the dawn of sound.
Yeah, well, I mean, every art form is constantly evolving, and film is still an infant format. It's um, still evolving to this day. But even in that period between 1920 and 1930, you see directors figure out blocking and camera angles, and there's all these technological developments that are being made in order to make it a more fluid art form.
Hmm. Oh, absolutely. So, what was the earliest? So, we mentioned Lon Chaney earlier. How long had Man Who Laughs been in development at Universal?
Well, Universal had announced it as a follow-up for Hunchback of Notre Dame as early as 1924. They actually uh, placed a press release saying we're making this film with Lon Chaney. Chaney had other ideas, obviously, and so it got tabled. And by 1927, Lenny had obviously done The Cat and the Canary and The Chinese Parrot, and those were both films that Universal felt confident enough with him to give him something stylistically very interesting. And so they gave him a big budget. And I don't know whose choice it was to do Man Who Laughs, whether it was Carl Laemmle himself or his son, who was head of production at the time, or Paul Kohner, who produced the film, or Lenny himself. But whatever the case was, it was a really good choice.
Mhm. Oh yeah, definitely. So by the time it was released in 1928, sound movies were becoming a little bit more mainstream, so it was released with a synchronized movie tone soundtrack. How did it do with audiences at that time? Were they hungry for sound, or were they still fascinated by this song?
Well, it opened in New York in April 28th, and it didn't have a soundtrack at that point. They were playing it with an orchestra. But that was for the main first run release of the film, and the reviews were pretty good. Most critics thought it was a little too gruesome for most audiences at the time, but they all said this is a very artistic production. So they were rather mixed about how the film was. The film went into general distribution in September of that year, and at that point is when they added the movie tone soundtrack to it, which was something that most of the studios were doing at the time. Stuff that was already in the canon silent, they would add a music and effects track to it in order to at least advertise that it was in some form of sound. In other films, they actually took actors and reshot certain sequences in sound, and they called that goat glanding the film. If you've ever seen the film that Universal made that same season, Lonesome, there are
Yes.
three talking sequences in that, and that's what happened. They had initially shot the film as a silent film, and then sound came in and was popular, and they said, "Oh well, we got to have some talking in this." So they rather awkwardly staged these three talking sequences in the film and edited them in.
Yeah, those are always kind of fun to see, just from a technical standpoint and experimental standpoint. Not unlike the Jazz Singer, people forget that's mostly a silent film, with the exception of a couple of musical and talking sequences. All right, so I don't think we can close this out without bringing up the elephant in the room, and this is the reason that I suspect most of our people in the audience are watching this in the first place. So, what is the man who laughs great claim to fame in pop culture?
Well, it depends on who you ask, but I think the general consensus is that Gwynplaine, especially in his clown makeup, is the inspiration for the Joker in the comic books of the Batman. And there are two different stories about this, so I don't know which one is true. Bob Kane said that Bill Finger brought him a picture of Bob Veidt in the makeup in the film, and he based it upon that. And then Finger said that it wasn't really brought up until after the fact, that he said that looks like um, uh, Veidt and Man Who Laughs. But whatever the story is, they obviously were aware of the film and they were aware of what Conrad Veidt looked like in the movie.
Yeah.
Similarly, I mean, the Batman in many ways has a lot of lineage to the 1926 film The Bat,
Mhm.
which is based on a Broadway play at the time. It was later remade several times, including with Vincent Price. But there's a lot of imagery in that if you read the first Detective Comics that has Batman in it, his introduction, in many ways, there are entire panels that are lifted out of that film.
Yeah. And that was kind of the beauty of that early art form in the American comic books was a lot of these guys, these were teenagers. I think Bob Kane was like 17 or 18 when he got credit for creating Batman. And you look at a lot of those images, like the famous Batman pose when he's crouched on a rooftop. I believe that was swiped from an old Tarzan comic strip, if I'm not mistaken. They would take whatever they could find and use it as reference.
Undoubtedly, the comic book art form in many ways sort of mirrored the motion picture art form in that they were relatively new styles of telling a story. They were artwork telling a story, like directly narratives, as opposed to just a painting where you could infer what you wanted it
Yeah.
to, what the story would be in that thing. Um, but a visual form of literature, in other words. And comic books, it was considered kind of a lower brow art form at the time. Of course, now it's highly recognized as a great art form, but these guys were cribbing from each other and bringing in inspiration from any way that they knew. And the same is true for motion picture directors. A lot of movie directors were aware of other movies at the time. They were cribbing styles from other people. They had been on the stage. A lot of these the actors and directors and technicians all came from the stage, and so they knew what was popular on stage and how to translate that into motion pictures. And a lot of the European directors would have been, pretty savvy on artwork in general, music and sculpture and paintings, and certainly was the case with Murnau and Paul Leni. They both come from the same sort of European conservatory style of directing.
Hmm. All right. So, do you have any closing thoughts on the film? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I think the thing that attracts me to the film most of all, as far as its style, really has to be commended, which is the sets for the film. And a lot of these sets were built for Hunchback of Notre Dame, but a lot of them were built for this film as well. And it's amazing because all of that stuff you could really, in a lot of ways, never replicate it today, because you had all of these great European artisans that were brought over
Yeah.
specifically to do these movie sets, but they're all just plaster on chicken wire and plywood and that sort of stuff. I mean, when you see what all of that stuff looks like up close, it's really a laugh, but the way it's photographed and the way it's meant to be photographed, it's really a beautiful thing.
It really is. Now, you have quite the impressive resume yourself. What are you working on right now? Is there anything you want our audience to know about?
Well, I kind of spread myself a little too thin sometimes with work, but we've got a number of things. I have a company called 3D Film Archive, and we mostly restore 3D films from the 1920s up to the 1980s, stuff that was shot on film in 3D. But we also do, not 3D stuff as well. So I'm just wrapping up right now. We're doing season 2 of the Abbott and Costello TV show.
Oh, cool.
That'll be coming out from Classic Flicks probably at the end of the year, early next year. We're just about to go into a 3D film with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis called Money from Home. We're working with Paramount Pictures on that. Um, we're just wrapping up the first major American 3D film, Buona Devil, which is sort of a landmark film if you know 3D. And then not 3D stuff, I'm working on a number of Max Fleischer color cartoons from the 1930s, working with fabulous Fleischer cartoons restored with that and Paramount Pictures. And I've got a few silent film things up my sleeve right now, but I haven't announced them yet. So
Sure.
we'll let you know when that gets put out.
Well, I mean, look, as a film buff, as a physical media collector, I'm certainly looking forward to all of those projects. Mr. Jack Theakston, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Ryan.
Of course. And for you guys in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film. We'll see you next time.